Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania has yielded stone tools dated to 2,600,000 years before the present. The tool makers were not yet Homo sapiens. By 1,800,000 years before the present, Homo erectus had left Africa entirely. Skulls recovered at Dmanisi in the Republic of Georgia date to 1,850,000 BC. They mark one of the earliest known human presences outside Africa. The Levant Corridor, a narrow strip of land bridging Africa and Asia, served as the route. No maps existed. No language survives from this period in any recoverable form. Yet the migration happened repeatedly across tens of thousands of years. What does it mean that a species without symbols, without recorded speech, without any external memory system, managed to walk out of one continent and populate three others before anatomical modernity even arrived? The honest answer is that survival itself required a kind of intelligence that left no inscriptions, only consequences, and those consequences are everywhere a paleontologist chooses to dig. Every stone tool, every scattered bone bed, every hearth scar in ancient soil represents thousands of small decisions made by people who could not write any of them down and who did not need to. The tools themselves tell a story of refinement. Early Oldowan choppers, crude flaked cobbles, gave way to Acheulean hand axes by roughly 1,600,000 BC. These hand axes appear across Africa, the Near East, and parts of Europe and Asia, remarkably consistent in shape across vast distances. A hand axe found in northern India bears a close resemblance to one found in southern Spain. The toolmakers, separated by thousands of kilometers and tens of thousands of years, arrived at similar solutions. Some researchers count more than 1 million Acheulean artifacts recovered across 3 continents, a single technological tradition lasting over 1 million years. That duration is difficult to hold in the mind. 1 million years is roughly 4,000 times longer than the span separating the present day from the founding of Rome. Within that almost incomprehensible stretch of time, a single tool design persisted with only gradual modification, passed from hand to hand, generation to generation, without a single written instruction. The hand axe was not reinvented each time. It was taught, watched, copied, corrected. Teaching itself, then, is older than language as commonly defined, and certainly older than any script. By around 195,000 BC, fossil evidence places anatomically modern Homo sapiens in eastern Africa, with the Omo Kibish remains in Ethiopia among the oldest examples. From there, dispersal accelerated. Genetic studies of modern populations point to a major exodus from Africa beginning around 70,000 BC, moving along coastal and inland routes into Arabia and South Asia. Mitochondrial DNA lineages traced across living populations in Australia, Siberia, and the Americas converge on this African origin. The genetic record functions, in a sense, as an unwritten ledger, one that modern science has learned to read only in the last few decades. The crossing into Sahul, the combined landmass of Australia and New Guinea during periods of lower sea level, required deliberate sea travel by around 65,000 BC. This was not an accidental drift on a log. The shortest sea gaps, even at the lowest glacial sea levels, still spanned tens of kilometers of open water. Archaeological sites at Madjedbebe in Australia's Northern Territory have produced artifacts dated to this period, including ground stone tools and pigment fragments. Reaching that landmass meant building a vessel capable of carrying people, and doing so with intent, repeated successfully enough to establish a lasting population. It is worth pausing on the difference between an accident and a strategy, because the archaeological record increasingly favors the latter explanation for events like the Sahul crossing. An accidental raft might carry 1 or 2 survivors to an unfamiliar shore, but it would rarely produce the genetic diversity and material continuity found in early Australian sites, which instead suggests multiple deliberate voyages carrying enough people, tools, and perhaps even domesticated knowledge of fire-making to found a viable population. Whatever knowledge made that possible, plant lore, navigation by stars, boat construction, traveled by demonstration and memory alone. Roughly 20,000 years later, a different migration unfolded an ocean away. The Bering Land Bridge, known to researchers as Beringia, connected Siberia to Alaska during the height of the last glacial maximum. Sea levels dropped enough to expose a corridor estimated at 1,600 kilometers wide at its broadest extent. Genetic and archaeological evidence suggests human groups began moving across or alongside this bridge sometime between 20,000 and 15,000 BC, though the exact window remains debated among specialists. Sites such as Monteverde in Chile, dated to roughly 14,500 BC, indicate that descendants of these migrants had already reached the southern tip of South America within a few thousand years. The speed of that southward spread, from a Siberian crossing point to the far end of a second continent in a geologically short span, suggests population movement driven by more than aimless wandering. Some combination of resource pressure, curiosity, and perhaps simple population growth pushed small groups continually southward, generation after generation, each one extending the range slightly further than the last, until the entire length of 2 continents held human settlements. None of these settlers left a single written record explaining their motives. Their motives must be inferred from where their tools, their hearths, and eventually their dead came to rest. Movement across continents solved the problem of staying alive. It did not explain why the dead came to be buried with such care, or why certain caves became destinations rather than shelters. At Blombos Cave on the southern coast of South Africa, archaeologists recovered pieces of ochre engraved with deliberate cross-hatched patterns dated to roughly 75,000 BC. The marks serve no practical function in hunting or tool-making. They appear to be the oldest known evidence of abstract symbolic design. Ochre itself appears at sites across Africa far earlier, used possibly for tanning hides or insect repellent. But the engraved pieces at Blombos cross a different threshold. A mark made with intention, repeated in a pattern, communicates something to another mind even without language attached to it. Whatever that something was, the people of Blombos chose to make it durable, scratching it into stone rather than letting it pass with a gesture or a sound. That choice, multiplied across tens of thousands of years and thousands of sites, forms the earliest visible trace of symbolic thought as a shared human behavior rather than an isolated curiosity. Burial practices offer a second thread. At Sungir, north of Moscow, graves dated to roughly 34,000 BC contained bodies adorned with several thousand ivory beads each, alongside spears made from straightened mammoth tusks. One grave held 2 children buried head to head, surrounded by ornaments that would have required, by some estimates, several hundred hours of labor to produce. Producing thousands of beads for a body that would never again use them indicates a belief that the dead retained some form of status, identity, or destination after death. This is the point at which low-effort explanation fails. A purely practical species, focused only on caloric survival, would not divert hundreds of hours of skilled labor toward decorating a corpse. The Sungir burials suggest a community willing to spend real resources, real time, taken from hunting or tool-making, on a belief that could not be tested, verified, or proven wrong. Belief of that kind, expensive and unfalsifiable, appears to be one of the oldest stable features of human social life, predating any temple, any priesthood, any written law about how the dead should be treated. Cave art extends the pattern into a different medium entirely. Chauvet Cave, in southern France, contains paintings of lions, rhinoceroses, and horses dated to approximately 36,000 BC, found deep within chambers that required artificial light to reach. Lascaux, also in France, holds a comparable gallery dated to roughly 17,000 BC, including the famous chamber known as the Hall of the Bulls, where one painted bull measures over 5 meters in length. These were not images placed near a cave entrance for casual viewing. Reaching them required navigating darkness for hundreds of meters. The placement matters as much as the imagery. Choosing a chamber that demands sustained effort and risk to access suggests the paintings were not decoration in the ordinary sense, but were tied to some restricted or ceremonial purpose. Perhaps initiation, perhaps ritual tied to hunting success, perhaps something with no modern equivalent at all. Whatever the specific belief, the consistent choice across multiple cave sites, separated by thousands of years and hundreds of kilometers, to place the most elaborate art in the least accessible spaces points toward a shared logic about where sacred or significant things belonged. Carved figurines spread a related practice across a wider geography. The Venus of Willendorf, found in Austria and dated to roughly 28,000 BC, stands just over 11 centimeters tall, carved from oolitic limestone with exaggerated proportions emphasizing the torso. Similar figurines, collectively termed Venus figurines by archaeologists, have been recovered from sites stretching from the Pyrenees to Siberia, a distance exceeding 6,000 kilometers. More than 100 such figurines are known. Their consistent form across such distance suggests either a widely shared visual tradition or independent emphasis on the same set of symbolic features, fertility and the human form, rendered in a way no single community invented in isolation. The most striking development in this chapter belongs to Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey, where excavations beginning in the 1990s uncovered monumental stone enclosures dated to roughly 9,600 BC. The site includes T-shaped limestone pillars, some standing over 5 meters tall and weighing several tons, carved with reliefs of foxes, boars, and vultures. Construction at this scale required organized labor on a level previously associated only with settled agricultural societies. Yet evidence at Göbekli Tepe shows no domesticated crops and no permanent housing nearby. The builders were, by most assessments, still hunter-gatherers. Conviction without a written voice still needed a way to travel intact across generations, and the system that carried it was the trained human memory itself, organized into structures far more rigorous than casual storytelling. In the deserts and grasslands of Australia, Aboriginal communities developed songlines, extended chains of song, story, and landmark that encoded travel routes, spanning, in some documented cases, distances exceeding 1,000 kilometers. Each verse corresponded to a specific feature of terrain, a waterhole, a ridge, a stand of trees, allowing a singer to navigate country never physically visited before, simply by recalling the correct sequence of song. The precision required for this system to function rules out casual transmission. A songline that loses accuracy over a few generations would lead a traveler to the wrong waterhole in landscape, where that error could be fatal. Linguists and anthropologists working with Aboriginal custodians in the 20th century recorded songlines whose geographic details matched physical terrain with a level of accuracy that suggested transmission spanning thousands of years with minimal drift. Some researchers have proposed that certain songlines may preserve information about coastline positions consistent with sea levels before 7,000 BC, a date predating any written record on the continent by many millennia. A different but related system developed across West Africa, where griot lineages, hereditary oral historians, maintained genealogies and historical narratives for specific ruling families across many generations. Among the Mande peoples, griot traditions trace certain royal lineages associated with the Mali Empire, founded around 1235, with some oral chronicles claiming continuity reaching centuries earlier still. A trained griot was expected to recite genealogies, extending across dozens of generations without error, a feat verified in some documented cases by comparing independent griot lineages from different regions and finding substantial agreement in the names and order of succession they preserved. The role of the griot illustrates something important about oral memory as a discipline rather than a habit. Training typically began in childhood and extended across years of apprenticeship under an established master, involving repetition, correction, and formal performance contexts where errors carried social consequences. This was not folk memory drifting loosely through a population. It was a specialized profession, comparable in rigor to scribal training in literate societies, except that the medium of storage was the trained mind rather than any physical surface. Polynesian navigation systems present a third model, one built around practical knowledge rather than royal lineage. Wayfinders trained across the Pacific learned to read star paths, wave patterns, and cloud formations well enough to navigate between islands separated by distances exceeding 3,000 kilometers without instruments. The star compass used by navigators in the Caroline Islands divides the horizon into 32 named points, each tied to the rising or setting position of a specific star, a system requiring memorization of star behavior across an entire year before a navigator could be trusted on open water. Voyages guided by this knowledge are believed to have reached as far as Hawaii by around 400 and Rapa Nui by around 800, populating some of the most remote habitable land on the planet, using no chart of any kind. Is it accurate, then, to think of these systems as primitive simply because they left no inscribed page behind? The evidence suggests the opposite, that oral systems capable of guiding a canoe across open ocean or preserving a royal genealogy intact for centuries required a precision and institutional discipline fully comparable to literate record-keeping, differing mainly in the surface used to store information rather than in the seriousness with which that information was treated. Physical aids supported memory without yet constituting writing in the conventional sense. The Ishango bone, recovered near Lake Edward in what is now the Democratic Republic of the Congo and dated to roughly 20,000 BC, bears a series of notches arranged in distinct groupings. Some researchers interpret the markings as a tally system, possibly tracking lunar cycles across multiple months, while others propose a more general counting device. Whatever its precise function, the bone demonstrates that humans were externalizing numerical information onto physical objects tens of thousands of years before any alphabet existed. A related but later device, the quipu, developed among Andean societies and reached its most elaborate form under the Inca Empire, beginning around 1200. A quipu consisted of a main cord with secondary cords attached, each tied with knots whose type, position, and color recorded numerical and possibly narrative information. Spanish chroniclers, arriving in the 1530s, described Inca administrators reading quipus to report census figures, tribute amounts, and storehouse inventories across an empire that, at its height, governed an estimated 10 million people. Some specialists studying surviving quipus believe certain knot sequences may encode narrative or historical content beyond simple accounting, though full decipherment remains incomplete even today. The Greek world offers a final, well-documented case of oral tradition operating at the edge of literacy. The epic poems later attributed to Homer, the Iliad and the Odyssey, are believed by most classical scholars to have circulated in oral form for several centuries before being fixed into written text around the 8th century BC. Internal features of the poems, repeated formulaic phrases, stock descriptions of characters, and fixed metrical patterns appear to function as memory aids for performers reciting tens of thousands of lines without a written script in hand. A skilled rhapsode could reportedly recite either epic in full across multiple days of performance, drawing on memorized formula rather than verbatim word-for-word recall. A toolkit, built from formula and rhythm, could carry an epic across centuries, but it could not track how much grain sat in a storehouse on a given afternoon. And that narrower, duller problem is where script finally entered human life. In the city of Uruk, in southern Mesopotamia, administrators began pressing marks into wet clay tablets around 3200 BC. The earliest of these tablets record quantities of barley, counts of livestock, and allocations of labor. They are not poems, prayers, or histories. They are inventories. That detail tends to surprise people who expect writing to begin with something grand, a declaration or a myth, when in fact, the archaeological record points overwhelmingly toward bookkeeping as the original motive. Uruk by this period had grown into a city of considerable size, with some estimates placing its population above 40,000, a scale at which trained memory alone, however disciplined, could no longer track every transaction across every household and temple storeroom. Script did not arrive to inspire anyone. It arrived to solve an accounting problem that had outgrown the human mind's working capacity. The earliest signs were pictographic, simplified drawings representing physical objects, a jar shape for oil, a head shape for a person. Over the following centuries, these pictographs grew increasingly abstract, evolving into the wedge-shaped marks known as cuneiform, pressed into clay with a cut reed stylus. By around 2600 BC, cuneiform had expanded beyond accounting to record royal inscriptions, legal rulings, and eventually literature, including early versions of the Epic of Gilgamesh, a narrative whose roots may reach back to a historical ruler of Uruk from around 2700 BC. The gap between the first tally marks and the first stories told in this new medium spanned roughly 5 centuries. Egypt developed a comparable system along a different timeline and for different purposes. Hieroglyphic writing appears in recognizable form by roughly 3100 BC, closely associated from its earliest examples with royal authority rather than commercial accounting. The Nama palette, a ceremonial stone object dated to approximately this period, combines hieroglyphic-style symbols with imagery showing a king, traditionally identified as Nama, asserting control over both Upper and Lower Egypt. Unlike Mesopotamian script, which began humbly with grain counts, Egyptian writing seems from its earliest surviving examples to have served power directly, recording names, titles, and claims to territory. This divergence matters because it shows that the invention of writing was not a single event with one fixed purpose, but a tool shaped immediately by the specific pressures of the society that produced it. Mesopotamian cities, dense, commercially active, and administratively complex, needed writing to manage resources. Early Egyptian kingship, consolidating a long river valley under centralized rule, needed writing to project authority and permanence. The same basic technology, marks carrying meaning, served 2 different founding needs depending on which problem pressed harder on the society inventing it. A third and far less understood system developed in the Indus Valley, across what is now Pakistan and northwestern India, with inscribed seals and tablets appearing by roughly 2600 BC at sites including Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa. More than 400 distinct symbols have been identified across thousands of recovered inscriptions, most of them brief, rarely exceeding a handful of characters in length. Despite a century of study, the Indus script remains undeciphered. No bilingual inscription has surfaced to provide a key, and the brevity of surviving texts offers little structural pattern for linguists to work from. The Indus case serves as a useful corrective to any assumption that writing automatically grants permanent access to a vanished society's thoughts. A script can survive in stone and clay for thousands of years, while the meaning it once carried disappears entirely, leaving researchers in roughly the same position as an archaeologist studying a wordless burial. Writing extends the range of what can be preserved, but it does not guarantee that preservation will remain readable, and the line between a literate society and a silent one can blur the moment its language is forgotten. China's earliest confirmed writing system appears considerably later, with oracle bone inscriptions dated to around 1200 BC during the Shang dynasty. These bones, typically ox scapulae or turtle shells, were inscribed with questions posed to ancestral spirits, then heated until they cracked, with the resulting fracture patterns interpreted as answers. More than 150,000 inscribed oracle bone fragments have been recovered, primarily from the site of Yinshu near modern Anyang. Unlike Mesopotamian accounting tablets, oracle bones functioned as a tool of divination, binding writing from its earliest Chinese appearance to questions of fate, ancestry, and royal legitimacy rather than commerce. Across these four independent origins, Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus Valley, and China, writing did not erase the older systems already described. Mesopotamian scribes trained for years through repetition and memorization, an apprenticeship structurally similar to the training of a griot or a rhapsode, simply redirected toward a tablet instead of a listening audience. Egyptian and Chinese societies continued to rely heavily on oral instruction, ritual speech, and memorized formula, even as their administrative classes mastered script. Writing layered onto existing oral practice rather than replacing it outright, at least for the first several centuries of its existence. What changed irreversibly was not memory itself, but the location where memory could be checked. A songline could only be verified against another living singer's version, and a griot's genealogy stood or fell on the credibility of the reciter delivering it. A clay tablet, once fired, held its content independent of any single human's continued survival or honesty, available for consultation by someone who had never met the person who wrote it and might not be born for centuries afterward. That shift, from memory housed exclusively in trained minds to memory externalized onto a durable surface, marks the true boundary the title of this account is built around, the line between what came before written language and everything that followed it.